Well, hello there. Happy Halloween, and welcome to The Night He Came Home, Halloween's home video history. My name's Doug Murphy, and as the title suggests, the purpose of this series is to document the history of the Halloween film franchise on home video. So basically what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at each and every release of the Halloween films in chronological order on various home video formats such as DVD, Blu-ray, VHS, and some more long-forgotten, obscure formats as well, so that should be fun. We'll also be talking a bit about the history of home video itself, at least as it pertains to the Halloween films. Before we get started, I should note that we're only going to be looking at the English-language North American releases in the United States and Canada, also known as Region 1 or Region A, and we won't be looking at any of the foreign releases, although there are many amazing releases all over the world. That falls outside the scope of this project. I should note also that I'm not an expert on any of this. I'm just a fan and a collector, and I've done as much research as I can, but there are bound to be things that I've missed or I've forgotten or that I just flat out got wrong. So if you notice anything that I've gotten wrong or that I've forgotten or missed, feel free to drop a comment and I'll bring it up in a future episode of the series. So without further ado, let's go all the way back almost to the beginning of home video itself with the release of the original Halloween. The original Halloween was released on November 25th, 1978. It was directed by John Carpenter and written by John Carpenter and Deborah Hill. It starred Donald Pleasence as the obsessed Dr. Loomis, psychiatrist of the homicidal Michael Myers, and Jamie Lee Curtis as Laurie Strode, the babysitter who Myers stalks throughout the film. It was produced on a budget of about $320,000 and ended up grossing over $75 million, becoming, at the time, the highest grossing independent film of all time, a title which it held until, I believe, 1990, when the original Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles film came out, which in turn was later surpassed by The Blair Witch Project in 1999, bringing it back to the horror genre, arguably where it belongs. Now, as I said, home video was still a very, very new thing at this point. Sony had just released the very first VCRs in their Betamax format about 2 years before, and JVC released their rival VHS format the year after that. So this was all still a very new thing. Prior to this, if you missed a movie in the theater, that was basically it. I mean, if it was a popular enough movie, they would re-release it in theaters at some point later on, or if you lived in a bigger city, they would have revival theaters that showed older films, or grindhouse theaters and whatnot. Otherwise, you would just have to wait until it was on late-night television, where you would get to see it edited for time and for content. Or if you were really lucky, you might be able to find a grainy 16mm film copy that you could show if you had a projector or whatnot. But other than that, there weren't a lot of options to watch movies back then, like there are now. So Sony came out with their Betamax VCRs. And it's important to remember that these early VCRs were literally that, video cassette recorders. They were invented as a means of recording television programs to be watched at a later date, what was at the time called time shift viewing. So you could set it to record a program that you would normally not be able to watch. And the early tapes only had an hour running time on them, so you couldn't really record a movie. You could only record a television block of up to an hour. Later on, when the VHS players came out, they were 2 hours. Sony's Betamax eventually went to 2 hours, but by then VHS had gone to 4 hours. So VHS was always one step ahead as far as practicality, even though the Betamax tapes were better quality. So it didn't take long for the VHS format to start dominating the market at about a 2-to-1 ratio, which would continue on throughout the 80s when there was this format war, which really wasn't much of a format war because Betamax was pretty much losing from the beginning. But it held out for a long time. So all you could buy initially were blank tapes. And then one day in 1977, a man named Andre Blay got the idea to release videotapes with movies and other programs already pre-recorded on the cassettes. So he went to his local library in Farmington Hills, Michigan, and looked up the addresses of CEOs of various film distribution companies, and wrote them all a letter, basically cold calling them in a way, just to ask them about licensing their films to be released on home video, to be sold to the public, to be watched at people's leisure. And of course, he didn't get a very warm reception to the idea, because you have to remember at the time, film rights holders had a very strong hold over the money they made from their movies, when you got to see them, how you got to see them. You know, if you went to go see it in the theater, you paid for a ticket each and every time you went to see it. If it was on television, they had ad revenue from each and every time it was aired, and there were licensing deals of how many times it could be aired and whatnot. So it was all very regulated. So the idea that someone could own one of their movies and just watch it whenever they wanted, having already paid one fee for it, they didn't like that. So he didn't get a lot of response from these companies. But there was one company that did give in, and that was 20th Century Fox, who apparently at the time wasn't doing so well financially, even though Star Wars had just come out, and, you know, that was kind of going to be a big hit for them. Apparently they were either in enough financial need or enough financial stability to just not care. So they agreed to license out their films to Magnetic Video to be released on video cassettes that were sold for about $50, I believe, at the time, which was probably like $200 in today's money. So they weren't cheap, they were expensive, and they were sold in stores that sold the VCRs. So they were sold in electronic stores. They weren't sold in box stores. They weren't sold in record stores. At the time, no one thought to run the home video industry like the record industry, as it basically is today, where it's a consumable piece of media that you purchase and then you can use many times as you want. They still saw videotapes as software for VCRs, so they were sold by the hardware manufacturers. So Fox ended up licensing out 50 of their movies, but they would only license out movies that had previously aired on television. So all of the movies that were licensed out were at least 5 years old. So there weren't any new releases. There was nothing that they felt that they might lose money on, because these were all older films. They could kind of take that gamble, I guess. And of course, the idea was a success. And Andre Blais had seen that, and he'd explained that in his letters to these companies, that this is the future. This is what's going to happen. And he wanted to get in on the ground floor. There were already lawsuits that were starting to develop around the idea of even just recording off of television, and what were the rights there? Was that legal? Could you own something that you had recorded, made a copy of? You know, so there was a lot of uncertainty as to where all this was going. But Andre Blais saw that this was the future. This wasn't something that was going to go away. So he made a smart move. So shortly after that, another man named Charles Band, who was a filmmaker, still is a filmmaker. These days he's best known as the creator of the Puppet Master series, as well as Full Moon Features, the direct-to-DVD film company. But at the time, he saw what Andre Blais was doing and realized this was something he wanted to get into as well. He was also a bit of an entrepreneur. So Band saw this as a way of not only distributing his own films on these formats, but also films produced under his production company, as well as other filmmakers that he was in touch with, and public domain films as well. So he started up Mita Home Entertainment, which was named after his wife at the time, Mita Band. So in late 1978, early 1979, Mita became the very first independent home video distributor. And they put out some films like Night of the Living Dead, which was public domain, and cult films that he was able to get for cheap, like Groove Tube and Tunnel Vision. And in the fall of 1979, about 1 year after its theatrical release, we got Halloween released on home video, on both VHS and Betamax formats. This year's the VHS, of course. It's got the original poster art, which I love, and it was nice of them to put the name of this web series on here, The Night He Came Home. It says running time 85 minutes, VHS format, the Mita logo across the bottom here, and there's a little warning that says this tape may be used only for private home use. The copyright owners do not permit the use of this cassette for any other purpose. It may not be shown in public or reproduced or copied in whole or in part. So all of the Mita tapes had this exact same yellow border, the Mita logo across the bottom, the movie either the movie poster art or a still from the movie. Magnetic Video did a lot of that. They had a black and white still from the film on the cover, and that was it. But then it has the information here. Instead of VHS, it would say Betamax on the beta version, of course. On the back, we have the Mita logo again, and then it's got a description of the film and a listing of some of the other films that were being released by Mita at the time. The description reads, "The most successful independent motion picture of all time. A horror classic starring Donald Pleasance, Jamie Lee Curtis, PJ Soles, and Nancy Loomis. Michael Myers escapes from the Illinois State Mental Hospital after 15 years treatment for the brutal murder of his sister and is returning to Haddonfield to relive his crime. Michael sets about systematically killing his prey while Dr. Loomis searches for a clue that will lead him to Michael. What follows is a reign of terror. He came home for Halloween and may return." Not sure what that means. If he came home, then he did return, but whatever. They also misspell Myers, M-E-Y-E-R-S, rather than M-Y-E-R-S. And you'll notice it's very plain. There aren't any photos. There's no screenshots of the movie or any promotional photos from the movie. There's also no barcode. This was an era before barcodes were sort of ubiquitous now. They're on every single thing you buy. Whereas back then, they were on a few items. I think around this time, the record industry was starting to put them on their albums. But original home videos prior to the early to mid 80s didn't have any barcodes. Along the side, plain, kind of creamy off-white color, just says Halloween. Mita logo again, the same there, same on top. And then the tape itself has the Mita logo. It's got this exact same thing as it says on the front of the package. Halloween, color, 85 minutes, and the same warning that it has on there. And I don't have the case for it, but I have a Betamax tape of the Mita release of the film as well. But you'll notice mine has the exact same label. Well, the VHS copies actually had a smaller label. Mine, for some reason, has a Betamax label on it, so it's a little bit larger than sort of the space that it's supposed to be intended for. So I'm guessing what happened is, like I said, there was about a 2-to-1 selling ratio of VHS players to Betamax players by about 1978, 79, and so presumably they had printed a lot more Betamax labels than they needed, so the extra ones would just get stuck on the VHS tapes. It's possible that this sold really well because some releases have surfaced of a different movie cover with a black and white sticker of the Halloween film pasted over top of it. So I'm thinking there was a high demand for the film, being that it came out around Halloween time. It was a really popular film. They ran out of copies, at least of the packaging, so they could duplicate more tapes, stick on a label from the Betamax for the VHSs that were selling better, and put a photocopied sticker over top of whatever other movie cover that they had. Now this one has a description of the film, like I said, at the top portion here on the back. However, the first releases of Mita films actually had a description of the company itself. So they all had the exact same packaging as far as the back went. So those were the movies that they would take. They would put the Halloween sticker on there, and they would pass it off as a copy of Halloween, which people at the time wouldn't really know better or really care, I'm sure. And of course, those are very hard to come by. I don't have a copy of it. I just have currently the VHS with a Betamax tape on it and a Betamax tape without a case. So the Betamax case is obviously the same. It's a little bit smaller. Betamax tapes were slightly smaller than VHS tapes. So the Betamax case, exact same artwork, exact same backing, just says Betamax instead of VHS on the front. Otherwise, identical release. Now, the big question, the most important question is, what is on this tape? Well, in today's age of extra special, super deluxe, limited anniversary, collector's edition, director's cut box sets, it's a little disappointing to find out that all that's on here is the film. That's it. And even that's not entirely true. But actually there's one other thing on it, and that would be this. So the tape starts with the Meta logo, then goes immediately into the film itself. There aren't any trailers, there aren't any interviews, there aren't any advertisements, there isn't even an FBI warning. I mean, I guess they covered it with the warning on the tape box and on the tape itself, so they figured there's no need to put it on the actual recording. So we literally just get the Meta logo and the movie. And when I say the movie, it's not quite the whole movie, because this is a pan and scan version of the film. Because for a long time now, films released in theaters have been shot in a wide screen format. Halloween used Panavision camera lenses, which filmed at a 2.35:1 aspect ratio, which means that the width of the screen was 2.35 times the height of the screen. And televisions at the time were a 4:3 aspect ratio, meaning that the width of the television was 4/3 the height of the television. So anytime a film would air on television, they had to figure out a way to convert from a widescreen format to the narrower television format. And there were a few options. The most obvious of which was to just simply cut off the sides of the frame. And so you would miss what was going on the sides. But normally what they would do is what's called pan and scan, is they would use whatever portion of the frame actually had useful image on it. So for instance, if there was in the wide shot, you could see one character on one side, another character on the other side speaking, and the camera was static. Well, you couldn't cut off the sides, because then you wouldn't see either of the people, or you would see half their face and it would just be weird. So they would show the one, and then they would either pan when someone else spoke or just cut straight to that person. So that was one method of doing it, is to sort of keep track of what's important in the frame for the whole movie, go through the whole movie that way. And another way was to squish the image so that everyone was a little bit skinnier than they were in the actual film itself. Later on, when they actually started releasing some widescreen versions of movies on home video, the standard became to add black bars across the top and the bottom of the screen, and that way you could fit the whole thing in the frame. So when home videos first came out, they were presented with this exact same problem. So with the case of Halloween, the question is, did they choose to pan and scan, cut off the sides, or did they choose to squish the image? Well, they actually did both. So if you watch the original Meta release of the film, the image has been squished slightly, not as much as was necessary to fit the whole image in the frame. So there's some of it's cut off, but it's squished enough so that you're not missing too much on the sides. And it's not that noticeable that everyone's a little bit thinner than they would have been in real life. But otherwise, the film is complete. All swearing, nudity, violence, all intact from the theatrical run. The film was originally recorded in mono, and that mono track is carried over to the video cassette, Beta and VHS. Both formats actually originally only offered mono. Stereo tapes actually didn't come out until a little bit later, so it wasn't even an option at the time. And that's about it for this very first release of Halloween on home video on both VHS and Betamax formats. Next episode, we'll be moving on into the 80s with a major change to Meta, as well as the popularity of Halloween resulting in the inevitable sequel, of course. So, until then, curfew is now in effect. Please confine your activities to your own home. Thank you. Have a pleasant evening.